Quantum consciousness, as illustrated by Roger Penrose in his formulation of what is known as orchestrated objective reductionism, postulates that the human brain itself as a biochemical process is insufficient to account for the complexity of consciousness as we know it. And he argues that what we're dealing with is within the neurons, we have these microtubules, and they are of a very particular nature. They have several important facts to understand. One, they are very small. They are between 1 and 23 nanometers in size, which means theoretically they are sufficiently small for interactions in the quantum realm. Two, they're roughly symmetric. This is important. Three, they are only active when people are conscious. This was discovered through his co-development with another anesthesiologist. Now, let's pivot forward because this theory has received a great deal of criticism. Several weeks ago, there was a study published on a rodent study, essentially, where they took what is called a microtubule stabilizer. It would allow the tubules to stay active when an anesthetic is administered. And they put that in one population, and then they had a control where they just delivered the anesthetic. What they found is the population where the tubules were maintained active, these rodents maintained consciousness for a longer period of time. This allows us to negate all of the other factors and isolate quantum consciousness. Now, what this means is that the neuropsychological approach that is what we call reductionism, meaning that the human brain is really producing some type of ephemeral or non-real thing that we feel is conscious when it's actually an illusion, which, to be quite frank with you, is rather trite and completely nonsensical when you consider the logic and reasoning behind it. Now, to take this further, there is co-developments taking place around the world, and one in particular is the development of what we call symmetrical nanoparticles through an entirely novel process. Traditionally, when you try to build nanoparticles, they are rigid. They have very bad edges when you look at them underneath an electron microscope. But the products this group has produced are completely spherical, and they range, ironically, between 1 and 40 nanometers in size. Now, consider the fact that these are symmetric, these are particular alloys, and they would exist within the realm of quantum interaction. Also understanding that our current theory of quantum is incomplete. I argue primarily that quantum is right now akin to a blind man touching the tail or the trunk of an elephant. You are seeing only a small portion of our interaction with the quantum field, and we are depicting it as such. In the case of electromagnetism, I argue that that is an outcropping of a higher dimensional interaction, and we are only seeing a subset of the dimensionality. Roger Penrose argues that there are, to be very scientific about it, these abstract Platonic mathematical truths that are non-computational. And that's a mouthful. Essentially what he's saying is there are truths that exist outside of our realm that are factual, and we cannot compute them because of the nature and within which we interact with that reality. Now, what we've seen in this research of the rodents is that there is validity to quantum consciousness because it can explain consciousness when our traditional theory that's more mainstream cannot. Additionally, these nanoparticles that I spoke to about, they're fascinating because what they illustrate to the audience is that these particles, when integrated into standard broadcasting infrastructure, defy radio frequency theory. Primarily, they are able to broadcast through solid matter when under traditional conditions of a standard RF transmitter with a low power or low frequency would not be able to broadcast through concrete. These have broadcast directly through concrete, and not only that, they have gone massive distances and been pinged at multiple distances in between their ultimate distance of reception. Now, these products are beginning to be manufactured, and they are soliciting licensing for this. I worked with this group for several years, and I learned what they were developing. And it stunned me because when I ran the math on how their system was working, to give you an idea here without going into detail, if you were to replicate the conditions they produced with the technology they produced using standard methodologies, it's more like a what if scenario. If you're familiar with the book written by the physicist What If, where you take, for instance, taking a baseball and throwing it at roughly the speed of light, what would really happen? To illustrate for you, if you were to follow standard RF theory under same conditions as this company produced, you would have to power their antenna with every power plant on the planet for 7 years just to get a single output point to reach that range. Now, to think about the consequences of this, they are many. For one, that's so much energy, it would destroy everything. It'd be like a nuclear blast because you pump so much energy instantly into a device, it would just literally obliterate it from existence. So that's not even possible. You also have the fact that RF theory prevents broadcasting electromagnetic signals through matter, i.e. Faraday cages prevent the transmission. And also one thing that you're seeing in this transmission process is zero data loss and very broad ranges of data transfer. What we need to think about now is that when you consider several things here, you have a company that's able to manufacture for the first time ever completely symmetric nanoparticles on the order of scale identical to what Roger Penrose hypothesized would be a quantum interaction point within neurons. We have data from that. We have data now from administering anesthetics in control groups. And you also have the fact that Roger Penrose is one of the most brilliant physicists that has ever lived. His work got him a Nobel Prize, which is worth thinking about in consideration of this. And in dealing with an acquaintance of mine, we were sitting down one time during lunch, and this man had the opportunity to sit down for roughly 2 hours with Roger Penrose. And I myself was skeptical of quantum consciousness when we had this initial interaction. But I asked him point blank, in your opinion, and he's someone I highly respect. His name is Barclay Burns. He is a Cambridge graduate. He has a degree in educational psychology, PhD. He is probably one of the pioneers in the world of what we call generative technologies, because one of the systems he developed during his development of learning.com was a multimodal learning process for phonics. Essentially, when you would press a keystroke on your keyboard, it would produce a sound. This was a novel approach to learning modalities. He subsequently did his additional PhD in strategy and economics from Cambridge. And while doing so, he was able to take all of the coursework in neuroscience. And he himself told me when I asked him point blank that Roger Penrose is a very, very serious physicist. And as I have seen one interview with Roger Penrose myself, and I have read his theory of quantum consciousness from a separate book, I dived into it further and I identified that there is some serious thought that's gone into the development of this theory, and that what the general audience obtains is not even remotely close to the work he's put into it. And now his theory is substantiated. But where does this leave us? Ultimately, where this leaves us is we are now at the precipice of an understanding that we can now verify that we do not have a very good model for quantum mechanics. What we have is a fraction of likely what is really taking place. Now, the reasoning behind that is rather direct, because when you look at the technology I've discussed and you use that as comparison against the theory itself, you identify immediately that there is something dramatic taking place that cannot be explained by the current theories. And this dramatic nature completely defies our understanding of reality unless we start to consider higher dimensional realities, which have obviously been postulated. Now I'm going to take this into a more esoteric realm, a more occultish realm. There is the occult realm that is familiar with a book called The Kabbalion. It's written by a pseudonym of three initiates. It was written, I believe, in me on that. But this book illustrates 7 principles of what are called hermeneutics. Ideally, they believe this was proposed originally by a gentleman named Hermes Trismegistus that entered ancient Egypt and taught them of these things. And if you look at these 7 principles, there are great levels of synchronicity with quantum mechanical theory, which ironically was developing at the same time. However, it is very easy to understand that these 2 concepts could have been coming forward independently of one another, which also relates to this idea that there's a higher field with which we are interacting. And this higher field with which we are interacting, you see suggestions of it historically as well. You see similar ideas during the Industrial Revolution popping up independent of each other. And if you look at the Renaissance, you see multiple individuals coming up with similar concepts independent of each other. Now, when you take that into consideration, let's put all that together, okay? And let's pivot into the past with this Hermes Trismegistus going to Egypt. Why is this significant related to everything we're talking about? It is also believed that colloidal silver was used primarily during that period and that time. Now, colloidal silver, what you have to understand, are nanoparticles. They are edgy ones, though. They are not completely symmetric. And because of that, their properties are ill-defined and their reactivity with the body can be rather unhealthy. But if you have perfectly spherical allotropes of these colloidal silver aspects, you essentially are able to mitigate all of those issues, hinting that this gentleman in this era was from some type of bygone era prior to its time, which pivots me to Graham Hancock's work. Graham Hancock, if you're not familiar with him, he believes that the ancient civilizations of this world were the result of some cataclysm that destroyed a previously far more advanced civilization or sets of civilizations. And his argument has substantial evidence for it. When you look at many artifacts around the world and you look at the nature and development of these civilizations, they do not follow what you would expect if they formed from hunter-gatherer tribes. Quite the opposite. What we see is the older back in time, or the further back in time we look at the architecture and the structures, we see far more complicated, far more precise, and far more advanced technology. And then as you go forward, it seems that they begin to lose this technology. This is all related, and I want you to stay with me as much as you can. What you're seeing now in the development of quantum consciousness is only one aspect of what we would call the hockey stick curve of humanity. There is a great publication called Exponentials Everywhere by Roy Vela, and what he succinctly illustrates is that if you look at all advancements throughout the history of humankind, you see an exponential over time. And he argues that if you take all of these things together, you are going to see massive exponential growth in humanity's capabilities. That, to me, based off of the period of time of advancement over the last several thousand years, would indicate, as we are developing right now to help you understand, we're developing at such a fast rate that within the next several years, you will not be able to identify with the world around you relative to what it was in the previous several years because of the exponential development of technology and the sciences, etc. If this is true, and you look at the course timeline of development, it is very reasonable to conclude or at least assume that this is not the first time we have advanced to this level or a similar level as a society. Now, where does this leave us? Only with more questions. Was there a previously very advanced civilization that understood nanotechnology? I would argue yes, because we see outcroppings of things they have produced that we cannot replicate today that are beyond our capacity to understand. And reverse engineering them has been basically impossible, and explaining them away has been basically impossible. Now you take these things and you ask yourself, what comes next? Consider for a moment that if you are somebody who is trying to advance technology, advance science, or push boundaries. At no other time in history are you more able to do that because of the advancements being made specifically in artificial intelligence. The reason being is if you are an intelligent individual with tenacity, you can now integrate yourself and interact with a very intelligent system, and you can test your theories and ideas against it. And if you are sufficiently self-assured and self-reliant, that system will not bias you, but instead provide you with insights to be utilized in the development of the technology and ideas you are attempting to produce. In this way, we are going to see dramatic developments of individuals and technology. And furthermore, there was a study I read several years ago that poignantly illustrated what we have seen over time. And what we have seen that as technology is developed, the gap between the uneducated and the educated is rising dramatically. And that's because those that know can know more easily because they already know. And those that don't know have a much bigger barrier to entry because the process of knowing requires them to first overcome the initial hurdles. Now, because people see things that are in front of them and don't see what they can become, they ultimately conclude that it's far too difficult to reach those levels. This is true of the analogy taken to people who study math when they're growing up. I know many, many people who have given up on their ability to learn mathematics, and they have concluded that it is beyond their capacity, when in fact the reality of the matter was they were in a system where they had to follow a particular line and process in learning mathematics, and this was not advantageous for this population. And because of it, they concluded that they can't learn. This became a fixed mindset. And your beliefs structure your capabilities. Your capabilities do not structure your beliefs. Therefore, if you have the mindset of limitation, if you have a specific mindset, it will ultimately include your life. Does that make sense? I want to say it again. Your mindset ultimately concludes your life. And because people only see what's in front of them, they see a massive barrier to entry. But what they don't realize is if they started to learn, they started to grow, their growth rate would at a certain point become exponential. To illustrate this in my own life, I myself was a dropout. I dropped out of school. I missed a lot of school in elementary. I mean, a lot. I never learned cursive. I was constantly sick. I had massive social anxiety. And this was in a bygone era compared to today where this is ubiquitous. And what I found is that when I was 18, after I'd put myself back in school at 15, I started in 10th grade. I started math. I had put it off and put it off and put it off because I thought it was beyond me and I was terrified of it. But at the age of 18, mind you, I began to study long division. Within a year and a half, I was in calculus. I want to say it again. I started to study long division, and within a year and a half, I was in calculus. Now, I want to be very clear. All I did was math for the next several semesters. But what that allowed me to do was build a framework that continually had to build on the framework in order to substantiate itself. It reified the neurons, reified the structures. Basically, it was reinforced learning. Okay. By doing the math and consistently doing math over and over and over, I built up this repertoire of understanding that allowed me to continually progress and also understand the difficulty of learning mathematics generally. I went on eventually to gain my bachelor's degree in applied physics and a minor in mathematics. Now, what I want to illustrate to all of you who are considering these ideas, these concepts, these growth aspects, is that really the ultimate limitation you have is the one you place upon your own mind. Because from a very young age, I saw the world as a primarily negative place. And even though I felt intellectually intelligent, even though I was uneducated, I felt intelligent. I had the inability to express it properly. This was later recognized as a diagnosis of ADHD, which I only got recently. However, I can illustrate to you clearly that Since that diagnosis and the subsequent medication, I've found the ability to hone my intelligence and give it direction. And even previously, without that ability, I accomplished a substantial amount because of my relatively decent IQ. And on a different note, but related, I don't place a whole lot of stock in IQ because it wasn't built to be a measure of fixed intelligence. It was meant to be a remedial measurement, and it was developed in France. And the co-developer brought it to the United States, reutilized it as a standardized measurement when the original structure of how you create the IQ, what you call vector math, does not substantiate the use case today. And the reason I say that and why it's so important for you to understand that IQ is not relevant to developing the right mindset and the right way of being is because when you test for intelligence, you use something called a G quotient. This G quotient is factor related to multiplying things together. But what you have to understand is in mathematics, when you multiply things together, you can change the order of multiplication to get the same result under standard conditions that are not vector related. But they were using vector math to do these multiplications, which means the vectors that they were associating with different parts of intelligence, these lines of intelligence, as we'll call them, you cannot get the same answer if you reorder the vectors. And that is really significant, because it shows that this is not a universality. It is merely proving itself, meaning the test only validates itself. It does not validate intelligence. But it has actually become a rather useful metric. But I do want to throw that in there because your mindset is so important. And why am I stressing all this when the whole idea here was quantum consciousness? Because what I want you to understand is that all of this is related. Quantum consciousness is the theory of consciousness as it relates to reality. And the growth of humanity has gone over an intense curve for quite some time, to the point now we're beginning to peak. And all of these things are being developed simultaneously: quantum consciousness, artificial intelligence, biological engineering, and every other field is going to begin to blossom in a way like we never understood previously. And what this is going to do to many people is it's going to alienate them. And to avoid this alienation, you need to recognize that this is a mindset issue, and that if you endure long enough, you'll find over time that it will become an exponential. And that won't happen overnight. It might not happen in several years. But if you study and push yourself in a number of different fields and become self-taught, you'll find that in due process, by stratifying all knowledge that you can, you'll develop into a far more intellectual and intelligent individual, because you will also be increasing your vocabulary, which is directly related to the measurements of intelligence. I argue that that is primarily because it's a form of vector analysis or mind map analysis, meaning that as you know more and more different words, you're creating more and more points for your brain to interact with memories and coordinate information. Because, for instance, let me give you an idea related to generative AI. If you want to prime the AI to act in a certain way, give it the name of a particular person within the domain of your interest, meaning if you want to role play, when you give it that name of somebody who has a lot of literary work behind them, it will condition itself to act according to that reference. In like manner, your vocabulary will condition you to pull specific data sets of information and correlate them accordingly, and then amalgamate them into some fluidity. Now we're going to take another concept of what we've discussed here that was hinted at, but we didn't dive into it completely. It is this idea that consciousness exists in a higher plane. Now, if you look at the work of Joseph Campbell, he found that throughout humankind and its history, you have concepts and myths that pop up over and over. And he understood that if you really want to understand humanity, look at their myths, don't look at their history, because their myths tell you what humans really are. And you find ideas that pop up independent of each other that are identical in nature with different stories. And this is how we get the hero's journey. This is how you have the mentor, you have the hero, you have the virgin mother. These things are seen across history independent of each other in their apparent formulation. Now, when you consider that, I want you to think for a moment about quantum consciousness, because this is all related to resonant frequencies and the development of concepts in some type of what we would call shared reality that exists outside of direct domain, but is nonetheless tangible. To illustrate, consider that this is an occurrence that happens to everyone I know. There will be a time when you will be thinking of a person and then they will call you. Now, the traditional empirical method says that this is just a statistical bias based off of exposure. However, it is a ubiquitous occurrence throughout all of humankind that can relate to this thing that, oh yeah, I was thinking of John and he just called me. That idea I want you to think about when you think about these shared higher level ideas of consciousness. The Virgin Mother, for instance, or the hero, or if you look at the Renaissance and you look at what developed there, like I said earlier, ideas developing independent of one another. And then if you pivot to the Industrial Revolution and you look at the ideas that I talked about with the Kabbalion coming out at the same time as the ideas of consciousness or ideas of quantum mechanics. And you look at all of this and you can identify that there is an underlying theme, and you can even pivot it back to some ancient religions. If you consider Hinduism and you look at the Vedas, the talk of Brahman and the talk of the Atman, they describe both an individual consciousness and then a unified underlying consciousness. And then they also talk about this illusion of separateness that I know most people experience, this feeling of separateness from the rest of humanity. This is called Maya in Hinduism and is a ubiquitous occurrence among individuals I have ever met, unless they consciously develop the understanding that we are all connected. When you take all of these things that I have discussed into account, it would seem that there is actually substantial evidence throughout all of history that consciousness is both individual and it is also intersubjective. We also can take into account the work of Carl Jung, of Freud, and many others that have identified as groping at the elephant something that exists, that is tangible, and yet we cannot properly articulate it. But yet we can see multiple formulations that reference the exact same thing, but with different vocabulary. Now I leave you on this note to think about the things we've discussed. Consider, what is the vitality of quantum consciousness? What is the vitality of an intersubjective consciousness? And what do we really know about quantum mechanics? Finally, in this development, we see that all things are developing at an exponential rate, and that the boundary between those that know and those that don't is ever increasing. And this is creating a barrier to entry that is largely illusory and not actual. But because the human brain sees the complexity of what is in front of them, they will not endeavor, they will not approach. And if you want to overcome this, you need to diminish the beliefs that you are limited, and you need to understand that IQ is fluid and that it can increase over time, and that your capability for social interaction and for other things can increase over time. I leave you with that, and this is a Hero Resonance broadcast.